The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honor to rise virtually in adjournment proceedings to address a question I initially asked on October 19th, not that long ago, in relation to the ongoing conflicts between the Mi'kmaq and Nova Scotia and non-Indigenous fishermen, but more specifically in the context of systemic racism. We know that name Donald Marshall Jr., as I said on October 19th, will always be remembered in Canada as synonymous with injustice as well as systemic racism. He was jailed for 11 years for a crime he did not commit. And when he was finally out of jail and continued to play a significant role in Indigenous rights for the Mi'kmaq people, 2 different court cases bear his name. And the Marshall case stands for the proposition that, of course, the treaties of peace and friendship of 1760, 1761 established that Mi'kmaq and Maliseet and Passamaquoddy rights to land and resources were never surrendered. And then the fact that he took that all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada was because for the simple act of fishing eels in what was considered out of season, but was completely within Mi'kmaq fishing rights. Well, Madam Speaker, the systemic racism that I want to address is deeper than the RCMP actions in failing to protect the Mi'kmaq lobster catch, nor the lobster pound in West Pubnico, where the Mi'kmaq catch was being stored, as we know, was burnt to the ground while the RCMP stood by. I referenced in my question on October 19th that how is it that there's never any shortage of well-equipped RCMP officers to move in to arrest nonviolent Indigenous protesters protecting their land and resources anywhere across Canada, but particularly in my home province of British Columbia. And yet there somehow was a failure of the RCMP to protect Indigenous property. Well, it's much deeper than these several episodes, Madam Speaker. When you look at the statistics of how injunctions are granted, and it is injunction law that allows RCMP officers to be converted from public security and public safety officers into essentially the private police of corporations operating on Indigenous lands. The Yellowhead Institute, in a study in October 2019, noted that when corporations go to court and seek an injunction to prevent Indigenous people from interrupting their commercial enterprises, corporations succeed before the courts in gaining an injunction 76% of the time. In contrast, when Indigenous people go to court to seek injunctions to protect their land from corporate operations, they are rejected 81% of the time. Thus, the system in which we operate, Madam Speaker, is, again, systemically racist in that the RCMP are far more likely to show up with, in the case of the Elsipogtog, Indigenous actions against fracking. Back in 2013 in New Brunswick, Mi'kmaq residents in full possession of their rights in a nonviolent protest against fracking had the police show up with attack dogs. They showed up well armed. They arrested people. They arrested them forcefully. This is quite an outrage when you look at the history of how the RCMP operate to enforce injunctions to protect resource extracting companies where their rights to extract resources come right up against Indigenous rights as recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada. And yet over and over again, it is Indigenous people who are not protected by the RCMP and corporations that are. When we look at what's happened in British Columbia, certainly injunctive relief was available.
Apologies, but the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness has 4 minutes to answer.
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. Nice to see you through technology, and thanks to the member for Saanich Gulf Island, who I'm also happy to see again. As usual, she's raising some very good questions and giving us information about injunctions that are statistically given more readily to corporations. I find that interesting. I'll look into that deeper because it's true that systemic racism is not limited to RCMP actions. It goes far beyond that. It's institutional, and it's important to address that. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to the situation in Nova Scotia. This situation has arisen as a result of the establishment of a subsistence fishery by the Sipeknaktik Nation. Apologies for the pronunciation. I'll begin by commenting on the criminal acts committed in the dispute between that nation and commercial fishers. Our government strongly condemns the racism, acts of violence, and crimes committed during this conflict. I implore all those involved to support constructive efforts for peaceful de-escalation and dialogue, especially as we continue to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. Our government remains committed to reconciliation and the development of a new and improved relationship with Indigenous peoples, a relationship based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and collaboration. We recognize that the RCMP has faced complex challenges this year, but we continue to work to build meaningful and lasting relationships with Indigenous peoples. It would be a real shame to let the criminal acts perpetrated in this conflict undermine those efforts. Any lasting resolution to this dispute must be based on the recognition of legitimate Mi'kmaq treaty rights. This requires an end to threats, racism, violence, and intimidation. The primary role of any police force is to protect the public and enforce the laws, including the Criminal Code of Canada. All Canadians enjoy the fundamental freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly, and demonstration, and should be able to do so safely. However, the use of violence and the endangerment of lives to protest is totally unacceptable. Those responsible for these crimes will be held accountable. The RCMP takes its role in maintaining public safety very seriously and has been on the ground since the beginning of the conflict. At the same time, governments have been working to bring the parties to a lasting settlement based on the recognition of legitimate Mi'kmaq treaty rights. Madam Speaker, charges have been laid and multiple investigations are underway into crimes committed against individuals, including the violent attack on Chief Michael Sack. Police are also investigating property crimes, such as the October 19th Lobster Warehouse fire, which was a sad episode in our collective history. To further enhance the RCMP's capabilities, the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness approved a request from the Attorney General of Nova Scotia to increase the number of contracted RCMP members present in Nova Scotia as required to maintain the peace. The RCMP presence in the region is unusually high and will continue to be high for as long as it's needed. The increased and enhanced RCMP presence includes uniformed officers who provide high visibility law enforcement and conduct random patrols in communities. The uniformed officers are complemented by additional strategic tactical operations officers from several jurisdictions. In addition, uniformed RCMP officers patrol the water in the region as required, and the RCMP emergency response team is equipped with a vessel for immediate deployment if required.
For Saanich, Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to contrast for parliamentarians the notion of Indigenous people having a right to a moderate livelihood in the lobster fishery of Nova Scotia and contrast that with Clearwater Seafoods. Clearwater Seafoods founder, John Risley, has a net worth of $1.2 billion from fishing in Mi'kmaq waters. Clearwater Seafoods has been found guilty by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans of gross violations of conservation rules, leaving their lobster traps on the ocean floor over a period of years, allowing for an illegal catch taking place. Clearwater Seafoods does not have RCMP showing up to give them a hard time. Clearwater Seafoods takes a huge resource, and I'm not against that. I just think that the contrast between corporate rights and exploitation and the way Indigenous people have been treated in seeking a moderate livelihood is a scandal. And I would ask all of us to examine.
And I'll have to give the Parliamentary Secretary 1 minute to respond.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. These are important issues that my colleague is raising, but I would say that the RCMP was sent to reinforce the Nova Scotia forces It is important to support public safety and de-escalate the situation. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
The